Okay, so in this shipment, there was obviously 3 wines, 2 reds, 1 white. We had a Pinot Grigio, which obviously is kind of a simple white, but I guess there's a kind of a neat story there with Pinot Grigio as a varietal that we're going to talk about. You know, all of these classes are kind of all about context. And, you know, even though we're drinking Texas wines, we want to make sure that you have some understanding of why we create these wines in the first place, or even why we even think that these are wines that we should share with people, not just members, but also the general public. And then you have our very first Bordeaux blend that we created, which is named after one of our members, Hans DeRocher. Many of you know him. And then we'll also talk about the new Social Distance and kind of the name. Obviously, some of you have seen this name before when we released the Merlot, but we kind of repurposed the name because it fits better for this new red blend. And obviously, there's growing pains there as far as the winery goes in terms of why this wine is actually kegged and not bottled, which we'll talk about. But, you know, as members, you guys get to see the good, the bad, the ugly, and sometimes the ugly turns out to be really delicious. And Social Distance is definitely one of those wines. Okay, so at any point, ask questions. We're going to start with the Pinot Grigio. Again, if you're drinking these wines and you have questions along the way, please don't hesitate to ask. You know, for me, I do lean on some graphics online. I do like the graphics at Wine Folly, so I will be pulling up some of those. But let's kind of start with the wine. You know, if you are drinking the Pinot Grigio, go ahead and give it a taste and a swirl and a smell and look at it and love it and all those delicious things. But let's talk about Pinot Grigio as a story. And as we kind of do that, I'm going to kind of break down the wine in terms of tasting. That way, this video becomes a little bit more precise when you actually link to it on the video in the future. So Pinot Grigio, this is Texas High Plains from a vineyard called Manser Vineyard, which is owned by Steve Newsom, which actually acquired the old Caprock Winery in 2018, 2017, 2018. And they have basically a 3,000 acre farm. I don't know if 3,000 acres constitute a farm or something much larger than that, but about 40 acres are actually planted, and some subset of that is Pinot Grigio. What I really like about the Pinot Grigio is one, its approachability for sure, but it's also one of the few white grapes that actually can have tannins in terms of a white wine that's not oaked. And if you are drinking this wine, you'll immediately notice that it's actually a kind of a dark color. And one of those talking points that you always hear me say in terms of classes is if it's this color, you got to ask yourself why. And anything that is kind of that straw, that canary in color or golden color has something going on with it. And we have to ultimately, as people and wine people, whether we choose to recognize it or not, want to understand why it is that color. And in reality, there's really 3 main reasons. And then there's Pinot Grigio. Pinot Grigio is one of these varietals that it doesn't look like a white varietal. And I'm going to pull up a picture here so you can see it. No, not that picture. There we go. Pinot Grigio. Pinot Grigio is actually a gray cluster, and therefore it tends to give color if it sits on its skin for a period of time, which is why when you go and buy, let's say, these amber color wines or these orange wines, a lot of them tend to be made out of Pinot Grigio, mainly because Pinot Grigio and Roussanne to some extent tend to have color in their skins. And so when you macerate, they give more color. So when I look at this wine and I ask myself, well, why is it that color? The 3 things that we usually talk about in palate builder classes and in general kind of wine training is that it's all oxidation on some level, whether it's oxidation from age, meaning oxidation from being in a bottle for a long time, or oxidation from being in a barrel, because again, barrels breathe, or it's premature oxidation, meaning it's a fault. And so those are really the 3 things that we look for in terms of why is it that color. The reality is there's always exceptions. And some of those exceptions include our aromatic varietals, which include things like Viognier, like Muscat, like Torrontés. And the other exception, while it may not be an aromatic varietal, is Pinot Grigio, or Pinot Gris, as we'll come to kind of go back and forth in terms of the name. I'm not to make the assumption, but let's set the naming, I guess, standard here that when we talk about Pinot Grigio, the term Pinot Grigio is Pinot Grigio in Italy, and then everywhere else outside of Italy, it's called Pinot Gris. Pinot Gris is a native grape to Burgundy, France, where it is actually a mutation of Pinot Noir, and which is why we kind of get these gray clusters, which then lend itself to not only more color in the wine, but actually if you age it on those skins, not only are you getting more color, but you're getting some tannin. And this wine definitely shows that. This wine has kind of a bigger color than you may expect from Pinot Grigio. And therefore, I'm on some level, I'm going to expect a little bit of a weightier wine. You know, when we think of, I guess, simple Pinot Grigios, what we really think of is basically a high acid, light bodied white wine that you can just drink and forget about, Santa Margarita or some of the others. In reality, the grape has the potential to turn into something more akin to a Chardonnay, if you will, like an unoaked Chardonnay, a non-malolactic fermented Chardonnay, and become a little bit richer, a little bit more unctuous, and a little bit softer across the palate. And then that also depends on kind of where we are producing this Pinot Grigio. Obviously, this is a Texas Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris. We call it Pinot Grigio because that's the grape that was planted. It was planted as a vine being sourced called Pinot Grigio. So therefore the wine has to be called Pinot Grigio and not Pinot Gris. Semantics, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. But in reality, the wine tends to be in a warmer climate in the high plains, as you guys know. And therefore the character of the fruit is riper, it's fleshier. It's not nearly as kind of austere and mineral driven, almost like you took limes and put them in a tin can and drank from that. It's a little bit fleshier, a little bit riper. For me, this wine has a lot of character of like honeydew melon and tropical notes and kind of these banana taffy, white flower components. And so what we expect from Pinot Grigio is a wine that tends to have elevated acid. You know, if you're looking at this sheet here that came with, I don't know if you can see that, but that's you can't see it. I can't see it on the screen, so you probably can't see it either. But it is the tech sheet that came with the wine. We can kind of go down the structure here. The wine is meant to be lighter bodied. It's meant to be in higher acid. It's meant to be soft in alcohol, even though this wine is a little bit atypical when it comes to alcohol. To have a 14+% alcohol Pinot Grigio that actually hides it very well in terms of its heat or kind of the ability to perceive alcohol is quite interesting. So the question is how is it able to do that? And the reality is it's got more fruit character to keep up with that alcohol to kind of keep it fresh and balanced. So when you taste it, hopefully you're tasting it. If not, no problem. I mean, the wine is just, it's refreshing in the sense that there's enough acidity there, enough kind of citrus character there to keep you wanting drinking more. And I've actually been drinking this wine for the last hour and a half, mainly because it's quite delicious. A couple of things about Pinot Grigio that we want to talk about in addition to kind of the color and production. Well, actually, I want to talk about production. Is that when we talk about lighter bodied, higher acid white wines, what we really are talking about is fresh wine. We want to drink the wines fresh. So this is a 2019 vintage. This wine was kegged. Let's see. This wine was kegged in the early spring, and we're just now releasing it in the winter because of, wine club logistics. But in reality, we want to drink this wine in basically one full vintage cycle. So by the time we get to the spring next year, we ideally want to be drinking the next vintage, obviously the 2020 vintage. Obviously, with Texas, there are some issues with the 2020 vintage. Very few whites were produced as it pertains to the freeze that we had on October 15th last year that basically killed a lot of vines. Anyways, I digress. So the production, what we're talking about is stainless steel, basically a harvest based off of ideally pH, meaning you want a wine that has brightness and freshness. So pH becomes a very important factor here. And unlike red wines, white wines tend to show acidification a lot more transparently than red wines. So given the opportunity to maintain natural acidity, we're going to choose to do that because the wine tastes more complete that way. It doesn't taste as one-dimensional when you acidify. And we've never really talked about acidification in any of the classes, but understand that particularly in warm climates, if to get full ripeness of a grape typically means you sacrifice acid development. And therefore, you have to either blend in acid or add acid to kind of get your pH at a place where the wine becomes stable. For white wines, we don't necessarily want the full flavor all the time. Sometimes we want a little bit of a fresher, lighter style, and therefore harvesting based off of pH as a priority over bricks kind of gives us that flexibility to kind of look at that. So while this wine is higher in alcohol, if you look at the pH line on the tech sheet, it's a pH of 3.5, which is kind of classic, what ideal for a light medium bodied white wine. If this was like Sauvignon Blanc or a Gruner Veltliner or a Riesling, we would be probably looking at a pH of anywhere between 3.35 and 3.4 to 3.45. Classic red pH is 3.6. So we're in the range that we need to be, while at the same time getting a lot of ripeness of fruit, and therefore that flavor is coming across the palate as ripe fruit, and therefore the wine is hopefully in balance as a result of that. The wine is dry. There's no residual sugar. So we harvest grapes. We ferment them at a cooler temperature than we would otherwise a red wine. Fermentation temperatures for white wine basically anywhere between 70 and 80 degrees or so, 65 to 80 degrees. And for red wines, we're really talking about fermentation temperatures above 80, 85, going into 90, depending on the style of wine that we're trying to make. So cool fermentation, no oak aging, no malactic fermentation, none of this kind of buttery character that we're trying to hide. Ultimately, if a wine goes through malactic fermentation, ultimately what we're doing is reducing the acid and increasing body. And so that's not kind of the goal of a lighter bodied white wine. We want to maintain that freshness. We want to perceive that freshness. And therefore going through malo is kind of contradictory. However, you will find malactic fermented Pinot Grigios around the world, particularly in France and Alsace and some other regions. More than likely, a Pinot Grigio that has gone through malactic fermentation is probably a Pinot Grigio that's coming from a vintage that is cooler or a vintage that was wet. That way they can use that tool of malactic fermentation to basically kind of enhance the wine to the style that they're ultimately looking for from previous vintages. And so block malolactic fermentation, typically the way that will be handled is basically through filtration. So the wine was filtered. And typically, one of the things that most of you recognize here at Vinovium anyway, because we are kegging wines, that bottle shock period is a little bit more extreme. We're putting them in a container with more volume and with no air, unlike a cork breathes. So kegs don't breathe. And so we have to be very careful about how we keg, because that keg shock period is much longer than that bottle shock period. And so while the wine is filtered, ultimately after it's filtered, it needs to sit, and then you really have a limited number of days in terms of when you can keg it after filtering. And then the wine is kegged, and then it's sat there since basically the spring. So it's been in keg for about 6 months, or maybe a little bit more. And so obviously that bottle shock period has kind of worn off. With the red wines, however, we gravity feed unfined to unfiltered, and that way it's a very gentle kegging process. And so that bottle shock period or that keg shock period is also reduced. So a little bit about Pinot Grigio as it pertains to kind of Texas. The number of Texas vines and acreage continues to grow year over year. Pinot Grigio is according to if you Google USDA Texas wine statistics, you'll get the current data about kind of grapes and acreage in Texas. If you go down that list, Pinot Grigio is the 24th most planted grape with a whopping 75 acres currently planted and producing. So if I put that in perspective, the global acreage of Pinot Grigio planted around the world is right around 71,000 acres. And so, yeah, we're in the big leagues now with our 75 acres. If you're drinking the wine and you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to ask. This is, for me, the Pinot Grigio, this is not a wine that is normal for Vinovium. Those of you, well, basically all of you currently have kind of been members since well before March. And so you kind of know that the system changed. And when the wine club model changed, it means our production cycle had to change to keep up with the new releases. And while that's kind of been a challenge this first year, it's also been rewarding, and we actually start to see the wine club system model work better for us and for our members. And so not every wine that we bring in, that we put our name on, is a wine that we intimately are involved in, from vineyard to basically growler. One of the beautiful things about being a negociant and having these relationships in the industry is we get to cherry pick. And when you have those relationships and you can go and taste wines with people that allow you into their cellars, and you say, hey, I really like that wine, can I feature it? They kind of get excited because we're telling a story that otherwise wouldn't be told. And this wine in particular is one of these kind of fun finds, if you will, where the wine was actually going to get blended into a larger blend and basically lost in the mix. So we kind of intervened and basically asked to keg a couple of kegs for Wine Club specifically. That way that wine, as much as we had liked it in the spring, would actually get shown as a varietal to the members. And so there's only 3 kegs of this wine. We use basically all the kegs for the shipment. There is basically maybe a quarter keg left at this point of the Pinot Grigio. So if it's something that you like, make sure to let me know and we'll hold some back for you. So yeah, it's a fun little wine. It's just very approachable. In terms of food and wine pairing, Pinot Grigio is, again, it's fresh wine. Think of fresh foods. So fresh seafood, fresh vegetables, fresh salads, cold foods. It's a wine that tends to kind of get lost with things that are spicy, things that are hot in terms of temperature. So it likes cool foods, it likes fresh foods, and you can kind of go on from there. Obviously, if we change the region, there's some dynamics there that change, particularly when we start talking about French Pinot Gris. French Pinot Gris tends to be a lot more honey, mainly because Pinot Gris there classically produced is done with, they allowed botrytis or basically a fungus to infect the grapes. So you create this honey kind of character that adds richness, but also they tend to leave a little bit of residual sugar in the wine. Those of you that attended that would have been, the Valentine's dinner we did, I guess it was this year, holy cow. The Valentine's dinner we did this year, the dessert pairing, or the fish course pairing, was a Pinot Gris from France. And if you remember that wine, that was a wine that had some residual sugar. All right. Quick and painless wine one. I guess let's talk about, before we kind of jump to the other wines, let me take that off. You can kind of see the the character of the fruit, that as we kind of go into a warmer growing area, the fruit character changes. It's as we expect. We go from kind of bitter citrus, bitter lime, to sweeter lime, more like key lime, and then apples, particularly Granny Smith apples, green apples, and then you move into sweeter citrus, whether it be lemons or tangerines, and then you kind of get a host of kind of fleshy character. I think one of the things that's missing off this list is kind of these tropical notes, mainly melon, like honeydew melon, and maybe even some canned pears or canned peaches. Those are kind of very classic characteristics for Pinot Grigio. The one thing else to kind of finish with Pinot Grigio as it pertains to Italian Pinot Grigio, Pinot Grigio in Italy tends to be slightly more bitter, particularly on the finish. And mainly the whole point of that is that they are doing whole cluster fermentation with those grapes. So as a result, not only are we getting a little bit more color, but because the classical production in a cooler climate is to have a little bit more tannin to create structure through the form of bitterness, those wines tend to be slightly bitter on the finish. And so compared to the rest of the world, really, and particularly in warm climates, we don't really use whole cluster because fruitier character with bitter character at the same time is a clash. if you have underripe fruit character with bitterness, it's kind of expected, and those kind of things pair well to each other. And so in a cooler climate, to add structure, because you can't do it with alcohol, you tend to do that through tannin. And in the world of white wines, you do that through whole cluster, meaning stem tannin. A ton of information. It's just like rolling off the tongue tonight. So I hope you're having a good time. Let's see. Daniel, you said it could be paired with spicy. I think Pinot Grigio for spicy food is one of the few white wines that, because it can have tannin, does not necessarily do well with spice. Because what's going to end up happening, particularly with a Pinot Grigio that is that color, what it's going to do is that tannin character, while it's very minimal, is going to become elevated. And which means when that becomes elevated, the spicy character becomes elevated. And so at the end of the day, it's not that it can't work. It's a question of, what do you want that to be enhanced? Both the kind of the tannin character of the Pinot Grigio and the spice character of the food is going to be enhanced by that wine. Also, if you're drinking a Pinot Grigio that is like this, where yes, it's still fresh and lively and has good acid, it is also weightier on the palate. It's thicker across the palate. And that's mainly because of the ripeness level of fruit that we're talking about at 14% alcohol by volume. So what's going to end up happening is it's going to become complementary to the spice. And again, it's going to enhance spice versus contrast to the spice. And so kind of a rule of thumb when you're pairing wines to spicy foods is that if you are trying to hide spice, you need a wine with higher acid. If you are trying to make spicier food spicier, then you need to pair that wine to a wine that has more texture across the palate, more richness across the palate, or even some residual sugar. And all of those things will enhance spice versus kind of contradict spice. Wines were tasted over the course of basically 72 hours, so a 3-day tasting. We tasted them fresh and then tasted them every day for 3 days. And for me, this wine kind of hit its stride right around day 2. You know, it did taste fine on day 3 from an open non-gas bottle, but the wine really started to sing on day 2. And obviously with a couple of hours of oxygen, it'll do fine. So let's taste this wine, and then we'll kind of talk about the naming and kind of where it came from. Anytime you taste, so this wine is 80% Cabernet, 20% Merlot. Okay. Anytime you taste Cabernet, it's all about kind of ripeness of that Cabernet, because if you have underripe Cabernet, things start to turn very green and bitter. And so I'm going to pull up a picture here that kind of talks about how you can even start judging your Cabernet even just based off of color. And obviously we kind of assume that a darker red wine will tend to be fuller bodied. And I think as a general rule of thumb, that is the correct train of thought. However, there are always exceptions. And one of the biggest exceptions are things like Sangiovese and Nebbiolo in particular, these grapes that don't have as thick or dark of skins that still produce very tannic, full-bodied wines. But in the world of Cabernet, in reality, the darker the wine, the more full-bodied the wine as a rule of thumb. And that's something that lends itself to kind of a value statement depending on who you're talking to. So when you look at this wine should be almost opaque. You shouldn't necessarily be able to see through it. And again, if you are able to see through that wine, then you have a lighter expression of Cabernet, and therefore you should be expecting not as full-bodied and also a more vegetal kind of green bell pepper character. That is not a bad thing. That just depends on the style of wine that they're trying to produce. It also depends on climate. And so it's interesting. So this is an 80-20 Cabernet Merlot. The cab that we're talking about is Hill Country Cabernet. So this is from a vineyard called Fauvel Vineyard, Fauvel Family Farms, a super small 3-acre to 5-acre Cabernet vineyard located in Fredericksburg. And the cab that's in this wine is different than the Cabernet Sauvignon that we'll come across when we taste the Social Distance Tempranillo blend. However, both cabs are Hill Country cab, which is for me a super fun thing. I mean, when we think of cab, most people think of High Plains cab because that's predominantly where it is. And we think that Cabernet is like one of these varietals that's almost like a unicorn for Texas wine, where you can't produce it consistently or with quality every year. And, that mentality is changing. And it's now whether Texas actually builds brands and takes market share for Cabernet from California and Chile and the rest of the world I don't know, that seems like a stretch. But the reality is that we're producing really excellent Cabernet Sauvignon, not only in the High Plains, but also in the Texas Hill Country. And we haven't even really talked about the cab that's being produced in far West Texas in Fort Davis, which is a totally different animal than what we're tasting in the glass or what you can really see from the High Plains fruit. But regardless, it's all about kind of ripeness of fruit again with cab. I mean, if it's true that the climate in Texas is too hot to make quality Cabernet, because Cabernet is a varietal that needs a long growing season, which it does. Otherwise, you get this pyrazinic character. Pyrazines are basically this character of bell pepper and kind of vegetal character. If you don't get the long growing season, you don't really get rid of that character, and that kind of dominates the wine. Well, here in the Hill Country, we start harvesting, or we start the growing season in April, early April, and we're kind of done by second week of August. Well, traditionally, if we're talking about Cabernet from around the world in a classic situation, assuming Northern Hemisphere, we're talking about Cabernet that starts growing season in April and is not harvested until mid to late October, if not early November. So the question is what's happening in terms of this Hill Country cab, where we're able to get really beautiful fruit that's not green and bitter, that's varietally correct, that's giving me full color. And really the question is going down to the viticulture, whether it's the clone that's selected here, or the yield per acre. Something is being done here in the vineyard that is making this possible and making this wine really quite exceptional. When we first put this one together, I actually thought that this was one of the best wines we've ever produced. And then we produced the Social Distance Red. And while I love this wine a lot, I think it's a delicious product. I can't say enough good things about the next wine we're going to taste. So I guess let's kind of move forward in terms of kind of tasting and why we chose to work with Hans on this product. And I recognize that everybody on this class tonight and who will watch this in the future, who subscribes to our membership, is a member of tremendous value and friendship to not only me personally, but also to the business. Some of you, and it's not just Hans, it just happened to be that Hans, I guess he was in the right place at the right time this year when we were making these decisions, go above and beyond for us. And it's incredibly heartwarming and incredibly humbling to see our members show up for us and share our world with not only their friends and their family, but complete strangers. I mean, some of you show up and you start talking to people like they're your best friends and you never met them. And then you want to tell them, you know, welcome them to our family, and you get them to join. And some of you do show up and do work without us ever asking for that. And you just genuinely want to see us succeed. And that's something that we can't ask for. It's not something that we can pay for. It's just a nature of how special this business is and how special our I guess the family is, and the personality that we kind of strive for here, and then obviously the wines that we produce. So the idea of what do we do with this Bordeaux blend that we've never produced, and maybe it won't be a Bordeaux blend in the future, it could be really any wine, was really to start to recognize our members in a more meaningful way, something that allows them to be a part of the story in a deeper capacity. And DeRocher is, while it's named after a person, it embodies kind of that spirit of how much our members actually contribute and give back to the community that we're trying to kind of cultivate here. Hans, as you know, he's if you don't know Hans is, he's a special kind of guy. He likes tank tops. He very rarely wears a long sleeve shirt, and he basically likes to help and show up and do things. And at the beginning of Corona, when we were kind of going through this process of selling part of the property, he was very instrumental in helping us literally move dirt to kind of make the transition of selling that property possible, helping with, gravel and paving and the tent. And they were actually here today cutting firewood. So on Friday, we can set a fire for Prime Ribbon Trivia. They kind of just do these things. And it was an honor to recognize him in this way. And it'll be an honor to recognize you guys in the future when we produce a wine together. And the way that we did this was basically we tasted wines with Hans, and then we sourced wines to put together a blend. And then he came together. He came to us, and we produced the blend. And it just means a lot to be able to do this wine. And I think it's a really great program going forward. So the wine is named after a member, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again in the future because it is a neat idea. So again, the blend is 80% Cab, 20% Merlot. As you kind of go through the tasting sheet here, it is not necessarily the reason we're drinking this first compared to the Social Distance Red is the wine is slightly less body than the Tempranillo blend, as we'll find out. So it is still pretty a big, medium, full-bodied, verging on full-bodied red wine. It's got big fruit. It's got big earth character, big tannin, moderate alcohol, about 14% alcohol by volume. And the story is that Foval Vineyard, small vineyard, grapes harvested in basically mid-August, and then they were barrel fermented and aged for 20 months in neutral, basically 40% neutral French oak, and the rest pertaining to new French oak. The Merlot you have all, I'm sure, tasted before. The Merlot seems to be like the MVP of the year. It was just such an exceptional wine that we wanted to use it in many places. One, to highlight it by itself. It was produced in the first place for Ocotillo, but the wine just was like, it's like the MSG of wine for 2020 for us. And so a little sprinkle here, a little sprinkle there. It just added so much character to the overall wine that it just was a hit. And so Craig is putting some information there. The DeRocher Red was kegged in June 27th, and then the Social Distance on 11/11. Let me pull up some other things to talk about as we go here, as it pertains to flavors of Cab and Merlot, and why they are so complementary. I mean, this is tradition here. We're not kind of reinventing the wheel with a Cab and Merlot blend, as many of you know. But let me pull up Cab flavors. Okay, Cab flavors: black cherry, black currant, cedar, baking spice, graphite, depending on what kind of terroir we're talking about. And then Merlot, cherry, plum, chocolate where there's no image, bay leaf, and vanilla. And when you look at these kind of just words on the screen, the Merlot tends to always be the softer, fruitier version of a Cab. And I say version of a Cab because on many levels, they're very similar. Where they differ, however, is in terms of their body and in terms of their dryness. Cab tends to be, or at least perceived to be, more dry, not just in terms of residual sugar, but also in terms of tannin content. The wines tend to be slightly more grippier than a Merlot. And a Merlot tends to be softer fruit, a little bit more red fruit, and also a little bit less dry. So therefore the wine becomes fruitier. And when I say less dry, I don't mean sugar. I just mean the perception of fruitiness is a little bit more enhanced with Merlot. And so when we taste these things, the reason they're complementary is because it's literally like you took, you probably have heard me say this, you took flannel pajamas and you wrap them around basically a prickly thing, a porcupine, if you will. So Merlot basically just gives Cabernet a giant bear hug, and that makes the wine a little bit more warm and fuzzy. But the wine should be medium full-bodied, dry, a ton of flavor. And if you're tasting this wine, you'll notice that the evolution of both structure and flavor, basically kind of from the mid palate all the way backward, is really where it's focused at. And then the finish is pretty pronounced. I mean, it's a long finish for such a young wine. And the reason why on the tech sheet we have the drinking window of 2025 is because there's a lot going on. You have decent amount of alcohol, or excuse me, decent amount of tannin, great color, and kind of this intensity of flavor that kind of just lends itself to aging. As a side note, we get asked all the time, how long will a wine age in a growler? And we recognize that there is some unknowns there, particularly as we start to produce wines in the future that need to be aged longer, particularly like wines like this and the Social Distance. And we're putting them in growlers. And the reality is we try to fill those growlers up as full as possible. So you're actually getting a little bit more than a normal volume for a 750 milliliter bottle. Those seals are very tight. The rubber, the gasket that makes that seal is very tight. Our experience is that we can age wine for several years. However, I have never aged a wine for more than 2 years and come back to it and have noticed no change, or the wine was still intact. We just have never done that experiment. So for these two wines, my background says that these wines will age very well. It's hard to say how they'll age in a growler because we've never done that long-term experiment. And maybe this is a good opportunity to do that. And we could talk about that in future years as we kind of revisit some of these wines. But at the same time, in the interim where we don't know, we have had conversations about bottling some of these wines for the wine club shipment, specifically in bottles that you could cellar. That's, again, as we kind of grow wine club and mature at this, those are kind of decisions that we're going to have to figure out, because I don't necessarily want you to drink wines that aren't ready to drink. Yes, I want you to drink them and enjoy them, but particularly like these two wines that are going to really start to sing in the next 2 to 3 years, I want you to have that opportunity, or at least that flexibility to do that. And so we have had conversations internally about what to do with these wines that would really benefit from some age versus just forcing them in a growler and making them go out that way. Okay, so in terms of production, the Merlot is actually the wine that sees the most oak in terms of new oak out of the two varietals. But together they just kind of come together and really make a pretty thing. And so you've heard from the previous wine club release about the Merlot. The Merlot is from Paca Vineyard. Paca Vineyard is about a 140-acre vineyard, and about 20 of those acres is Merlot. Same kind of production technique as the Cab. One exception here, that they were kind of harvested in mid-August, barrel fermented, and then aged on average of 18 to 20 months in oak barrel. The one exception with the Cab, however, is that the Cab underwent, under our élevage, basically underwent, what was the date? 24-hour pre-fermentation maceration. So what ended up happening is when the fruit came in, the fruit was basically allowed to sit in a cold environment. In some cases, dry ice is added to keep the temperature low, or the refrigeration was actually dropped. And so the whole idea is to prevent fermentation from happening. We're not necessarily concerned about oxidation at this point in time. As long as you have not fermented yet or are in fermentation, oxidation is not a concern, because when we do a fermentation, carbon and oxygen combine in the form of CO2, and that comes out of the fermentation. So it binds oxygen. So we're not concerned about any oxygen uptake pre-fermentation. And so this idea of a 24-hour cold maceration is really to extract as much color as possible. And then with the Merlot, we kind of underwent a warmer fermentation, which means that it finished quicker. With the Cab, it underwent a little bit of a cooler fermentation, and so it took a little bit longer. So in reality, in terms of going from fruit to wine, it was about 13 days in terms of a 24-hour maceration before fermentation, and then actually a 12-day fermentation cycle to produce the final wine that was then barrel aged. And so as a result, we get a wine with color, but the only reason we're not tasting anything green in this wine as pertains to cab is because the cab was actually either clone. Clone is a big part of it. That's why we're getting a lot of color and kind of the body. But the fact that we're not getting green character is more likely due to the yield. Again, we're talking about hill country fruit. We can make great wines in the hill country, except the window of opportunity is much shorter. And so to expedite or to, counterbalance that shorter window of opportunity, we have to sacrifice something. And a lot of that times it's lower yields, which ultimately produces a better wine. Okay, any questions about Cab, the DeRocher? Out of all the wines, well, the Pinot Grigio is super limited. That kind of, there's like a quarter of a keg left. The DeRocher has about 10 kegs, maybe 12 kegs. And so it is also a limited product. So kind of just to reiterate one last point about color here, as you kind of see on this image, again, the darker the color, really the fuller the body as it pertains to Cab. And it's one of these varietals that truly does, the color reflects its structure. That doesn't necessarily happen with all varietals, but it does with Cab. Same thing with the Pinot Grigio. The more color that Pinot Grigio has, the more unctuous and kind of rich across the palate you can expect that Pinot Grigio to be. Okay. Yeah, I want it to age some too. If you drink it tomorrow and the next day, it becomes quite stunning. The idea of opening a bottle and letting it sit for a day or 2 days, it basically is mimicking the act of aging in a bottle in terms of fruit character, in terms of tannin softness. What it does not do, however, is we call basically all the fruit character primary flavors, primary character. We call all the oak and the production character kind of secondary character. And then there's a set of tertiary character, which is all age character. And that becomes very interesting as that wine ages. And so while we can leave a bottle open for 2 days and we can soften fruit, we can soften tannin, we can integrate those things better through oxidation, what we can't do with an open bottle for 2 or 3 days is produce those tertiary characters. That's just time in bottle. So it does become quite delicious on day 2. Let's go to Social Distance. So a Tempranillo blend, 60-20-20, 60% Tempranillo, kind of thereabouts, 20% Cab from a different hill country vineyard called Hendrick's Vineyard, and then 20% of the gift that keeps on giving, the MVP of 2020, the Paca Merlot. Let's see, where to start with this wine. This wine has caused a lot of drama too in terms of what it was supposed to be and then what it actually ended up as. This wine was actually going to be bottled as the 2018 vintage of Sketch, and as such would have been just a lights out amazing Sketch product. However, it turned out being a keg product, and now it's a lights out delicious keg product. My only concern that I have really with this wine is the fact that we growler it instead of bottle it to see it age. You know, for me, I feel like this wine has a shelf life of quite a long time, 8-10 years based off of how it was tasting. And in reality, with the mindset that we had going into this wine, particularly with the Tempranillo, that was some of the best Tempranillo that I've ever personally tasted in Texas, was that if this is a bottle product, it's a different mindset than if it's a keg product, mainly because a keg product needs to be drunk sooner. Drunk sooner. I think it's drunk sooner. I don't know. Poor grammar. I think it needed to be drank sooner. I don't know the proper language here. Which one is it? Consumed. There you go. Need to be. It needs to be consumed sooner because it is on tap and it's by the glass, and it's not a wine that you're going to cellar really for an extended period of time. I would really love to see this wine under cork and in a bottle, but that's life, In a Corona year, you make changes, and one of those changes is we had to divert sketch program wines to keg program wines, really just to have a product to sell that would really replace 412s, the Tempranillo Grigio blend. And so while that was a kind of a painful decision to make, it was a necessary decision. And the wine is stunning on many levels. And the story that is more interesting about this wine than kind of its history of being sketch or not sketch was this wine is the first wine that we've ever produced where we contracted vineyard to production with 3 different growers, producers, and then took those individual lots and made one wine out of it. And the mentality of a negociant is consolidation of wines to produce something that's even better than if those wines stood apart. And I think this wine truly embodies that kind of spirit. And it's quite amazing in terms of how it all came together. Those of you know that we have been working with, well, let me kind of back up and tell the story fully. In 2012, when we started the winery, or started the process of permitting what would become Vinovium G Permit Winery, we basically worked with a group of 7 producers that we got them to keg wines for us. One of those producers was Dan Gatlin at Inwood Estate. And one of the winemakers working under Dan Gatlin was Mark Moberg. And Mark Moberg would eventually go on to work with Valley Mills Winery in Valley Mills. And so knowing that Mark had kind of adopted and was trained by Dan Gatlin, we kind of followed his Tempranillo technique, which is highly extracted, low yielding, very structured Tempranillo, kind of to summarize. And so we followed Mark Moberg to Valley Mills to produce that style of Tempranillo for us that we would eventually use for all kinds of wines. The one that is most common that most of you know is the 412s. So when we produced 412s, that was the first time for us to contract from that Valley Mills vineyard in Valley Mills, which is I think now a 14-year-old vineyard on a north-facing slope that produces quite exceptional Tempranillo. And in reality, that vineyard, while has really great fruit, doesn't technically sit within a growing area like the Texas Hill Country or the Texas High Plains, and therefore is just Texas, which is a shame. But it sits in a river valley, named after the Bosque River, and that vineyard has been producing Tempranillo that, in terms of where it sits, is North Hill Country, cooler climate, longer growing season, that produces a Tempranillo with a ton of structure. That's very different than what we see out of the High Plains. High Plains Tempranillo tends to be, while it has a longer growing season, tends to be way more fruit forward and less focus on tannin structure than this Tempranillo. Hill Country Tempranillo is also a different animal, a little bit more spicy, a little bit more racy in terms of acid, but very different in terms of what we're getting out of Valley Mills vineyard. So we kind of rolled the barrels over. And so when we kegged the 412s, that was 2017 fruit. The 2018 vintage went back into these same neutral barrels. And so the tannin that we are going to perceive in this wine, while there is some Merlot that has new French oak on it, 20% Merlot, the reality is this wine is intensely tannic, and as a result does require some heavy aeration, whether you're going to double decant or open the bottle and drink it in 3 days. For me, when I opened this wine and poured the initial taste, and while I did the tasting notes based off of a 72-day period tasting, I thought that this wine actually hit its peak on day 5. and was thoroughly impressed, and actually was showing some customers when they came to the tasting room to taste a 5-day open bottle of Tempranillo that I thought was just lights out delicious. So that's kind of the story with the Tempranillo, is that it got rolled over from a relationship that we had created with Dan Gatlin in 2012, 2013, that now we continue to use that Tempranillo in future vintages. And so while the 2019 vintage of Tempranillo is in barrel, when tasting it's nothing like this 2018 Tempranillo, mainly because that 2018 Tempranillo had very low yields, talking about basically a half a ton per acre of yields. And so we get a ton of concentration of tannin and color. The cab, the cab in the blend is an Alan Fetty product. Those of you that know Alan Fetty, West Cave Cellars, he's a guy that is a farmer producer, just like the other two gentlemen that we're talking about. But he farms a vineyard called Hendrick's Vineyard, and it's another hill country cab. So again, we're telling this story about cab in Texas, and sometimes, and more often than not, as we kind of progress through our story of Texas wines, that story is kind of contradictory to everything we've been talking about in previous years. What's unique about this Cabernet is that it is a clone from Bordeaux that is known to be more, what's the term? I want to say gamey, but it's more smoky, more intense, more savory, a little bit less fruit, but still fuller bodied and more tannin. And that kind of herbal, gamey, wild character in the wine is definitely coming from that cab. And so Alan Fetty, in terms of production, again, very what you would expect production to be for a full-bodied red wine. You harvest grapes, you separate skins and stems, and then that wine gets processed for basically a fermentation of 9 to 10 days. Alan Fetty did not do a cold soak or pre-maceration. So that maceration occurred during fermentation. It basically stayed in tank for a series of months after that. And then it was barreled down for about 18 months. So this wine basically got its maceration, its color contact post-fermentation, and then it went into barrel. And then we basically kegged it unfined, unfiltered. And so there is a little bit more of that kind of gritty structure there. The Merlot, again, Pocket Vineyard Merlot. This is the one wine that has that, and the cab have new oak influence. The Tempranillo is 100% neutral oak. And so the structure here in terms of oak character is really dominated by the Merlot and a little bit of the cab. Oh, man. The wine is aromatically intense. It's dark. It's earthy. It's got this nice little kind of, for me, it's like an iodine kind of character, almost, I don't want to go as far as to say gamey, bloody like a Syrah, but it's intense. It's medicinal. Wow, that wine is so good. Okay, a couple of things to talk about with the Tempranillo Cab blend that I wanted to mention. There's incredible iconic precedent for a Tempranillo Cab blend, or a Tempranillo Cab Merlot blend, depending on the vintage. And that precedent comes from Spain in a region called Ribera del Duero. So to put this wine in perspective, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the iconic producer that produces a Tempranillo Cab blend, and a little bit about the region that produces this iconic wine. That way we have some context for this. I like the name Social Distance for this wine. We kind of went back and forth in terms of what we should call it. Should we highlight the fact that 3 winemakers, 3 wines, 1 blend, the approach to that? I mean, there's a really compelling story there about the people behind these wines, and the fact that this is truly, when you think about the true definition of a negociant, this wine really embodies that. Typically, the way that we've always produced wine is work with 1 grower, 1 producer, and make a wine. This is the first time that I can remember where we've worked with 3 different people to make 1 wine. And obviously there's a story behind that. But the reality is that while that's a great story, there's also story behind the wine, and the story behind the wine is kind of the precedent of that style of wine, which is a big savory wine that has some fruit character, but is really dominated by its tannin structure, its acid structure, and kind of these savory, earthy kind of fruit character. And that icon that I'm going to talk about is Vega Sicilia. And so I'm going to pull up a picture of their bottle so you can see this wine. Let me make this bigger. Bodega Vega Sicilia, a winery that dates back to 1860 and created an incredible wine with true aging. And what I mean by that is that the current release of this wine is 2009. They only release wines after they've been in barrel or bottle for 10 or more years. And so that kind of goes back to the kind of the classic Spanish production. But when you go and buy this wine, if you were to buy it, it's about $350, $400, depending on where you find it at retail. If you go and buy this wine and open this wine, that 10-year age, it might as well be, 1 year or less in terms of how it drinks. The wine is incredibly tannic. They're not really ready to drink upon release. They're ready to basically age for another 10, 15 years before they're ready to drink. And really the whole idea here is it's a showcase of Tempranillo, of which case, in this case, usually a minimum of 80% Tempranillo and the rest of Cab or Merlot or even Cab Franc on some vintages. But Tempranillo compared to Cabernet is a varietal that tends to have incredibly fine tannin. And the only way to kind of put that in perspective in terms of what I mean by fine tannin is that it's very razor sharp tannin. It's like it hits your palate in a very direct way. It doesn't kind of wander across the palate. It's not Merlot. It's not flabby. It's very fine tannin. It's almost like tannin that's been working out. It's a bodybuilder tannin. Very fine tannin. And that tannin, when it's young, is very forward on the palate. And so when you taste this wine, all the flavor of this wine is all up front. And so as a product, while we really enjoyed that structure, I mean, that's the star of the wine. The reality is to release this wine now, it needed way more baby fat and a way more cushion to kind of make that wine a little bit more enjoyable. So here comes the MVP of 2020. The Merlot adds not only softness to the wine, but it also adds finish to the product. And the Cab just adds this layer of kind of savory, cherry, plummy fruit that we otherwise would not get because the Tempranillo hasn't really started to show its fruit character. The Tempranillo is all wrapped up in tannin and an acid. And so as this wine ages, we're going to get a lot more Tempranillo character. And what that really means is a lot more of these autumnal spices. Think of like clove and cumin and sage and all these herbal, savory, fall-like flavors will come out. And the whole idea is if we did this blend correctly, those flavors are going to complement kind of the fruity character of the Cabernet Merlot. And so far, again, if you wait a couple of days, if you wait till day 5 or so, the wine will really start to be quite special. So Vega Sicilia is kind of the benchmark icon for a Tempranillo Cab blend. And while this is a super expensive product, you can find cheaper Tempranillo Cab blends. The region that we're talking about here is the region of Ribera del Duero. And so I do want to talk about that briefly so you have some idea of where we're talking about. So when we talk about Ribera del Duero, we're talking about Spain, basically 90 to 100 miles north of Madrid is this horizontal shaped growing area. And through the middle of it is a river called the Duero River. Ribera del Duero is the river of the Duero. It basically goes through the entire width of the region, basically creating a north of the river and a south of the river situation, which means that if you are south of the river and you're planting vines, typically you're planting those vines in terms of an orientation northward, meaning you're planting on the north side of a slope versus on the south side of a slope, mainly because you want to have that impact of that river, which basically mitigates summertime heat. You get less heat overall being next to that river. Also because rivers create more wind flow, they kind of temperate the overall extremes of a climate. And so if you're south of the river, you're planting on a north-facing slope traditionally, which means that we're getting a longer, cooler growing season than if you were north of the river planting on a south-facing slope. Now you get full sun from early in the day till late at the day, and as a result, you have more ripeness. And so what we tend to see is that the wines that are more acid-driven, more structured, tend to be from the south side of the river, the Duero River, and those wines that tend to be more fruit-focused and alcohol-focused tend to be to the north of the Duero River. The region itself is continental climate. Continental climate, 4 seasons, so extreme winter and extreme summer, with about 17 to 20 inches of rain every growing season. So, which is not uncommon for our growing seasons in Texas, both in the hill country and in the high plains. The 50-year average for rainfall in the high plains is anywhere between 18 to 19, almost 20 inches of rainfall per year. If you look at the last 5 years, however, it's way less than that. So we're growers in the high plains are averaging I talked to a grower a couple weeks ago, and he averaged about 12 inches of rain in the last vintage cycle. And so while it's a 50-year average, the reality is in the last 5-10 years is the rainfall percentages is a lot less. So when we talk about Ribera del Duero, we're talking about Tempranillo. Typically, some of the best wines, the more modern style of Ribera del Duero is typically 100% Tempranillo, incredibly structured wines that you shouldn't really even drink for the next 25, 30 years. And then you have classic production, which is longer barrel aging, but they tend to use more French varietals, in this case, Cab and Merlot. And, this is all, Vega Sicilia is a direct byproduct of phylloxera. And we talk about phylloxera a lot in all of our classes because it was a pivotal moment in wine history, period. And so 1860 is a period in history that was building up to phylloxera. Phylloxera didn't hit Bordeaux until 1863. The rest of the world really wouldn't succumb to it until the 1890s. And so Vega Sicilia has been producing wines of Tempranillo all the way up until really the 1890s. And then starting in 1900, they started to add Cab to it. Always very traditional aging protocols in terms of very long aging. Okay, let's see. Let's check the chat. Is anybody drinking this wine tonight? Doesn't look like there's any questions. Well, I missed the trivia question. What was the trivia question? Oh, yeah. Social distance. Craig says, Craig, when I say the social distance spread is so good, you want to drink it by yourself. Blights. Yes. Yeah. What's a blight? That's a rhetorical question. Okay. So I really, that's kind of it. I guess to kind of finalize and summarize the class, again, everybody who's on the screen right now or participating in the class has been a member with us for a while. And it seems that after starting the wine club over in March and figuring out what the system needed to be and the value that we needed to add, obviously a lot of you wanted more education. And I hope that the virtual classes are in support of that and you're enjoying them. I would love to ask for some feedback or critique or whatever. If there's things that you would like to see us do next year, let us know. We're kind of in this phase of planning at the moment. I'm currently working on the schedule for next year, both in terms of virtual classes, which will continue, the in-person classes, which will of course continue, and anything else, wine releases and such. There will be a couple of schedule changes as it pertains to in-person classes. We learned, kind of how business is on Saturday evenings. Is that really the best time to do it? It seems that, or at least the thought currently, and again, I would love your feedback, is to move all of the in-person classes to Sunday at 1:00. So it gives us an hour before we open. So as those classes grow, we're not interfered with the public, and also so that as our staff grows, they can participate. And so it seems like Sunday 1:00 is going to be the time and day of the week that we do in-person classes. Tuesdays at 7 for virtual classes seems to be a good fit, so we'll keep it there. Let's see. Penny has a question. Please see my decanting question above about decanting on the card, and Robert's question about the QR code. Okay. The QR code does not work for me. They all point to 2018 Texas High Plains Ocotillo Red. Do they work for anybody else? Okay, let me scan it. So I for all of these text sheets, the QR code is a generic code that links to a page that has all the wines on it. And what will end up happening over time, as we kind of go down the path of a new website, is this will become a lot more transparent. Right now, I'm just consolidating the content on a single page. But so when these videos go live, so if you scan that QR code, it does take you to a page that has Ocotillo, but it also has other wines on that page. So what will end up happening is now when you scan these QR codes, the next 3 wines will be added to the list. So the Social Distance, the DeRocher, and the Pinot Grigio. This will get cleaned up a bit, so it'll be a little bit more organized so that you can select by vintage, and then the wines we release under that vintage year. And so while it automatically links to a page where you see Ocotillo is the first thing, just remember to scroll down, okay? The Penny's question about decanting. Let's see. So when the card says social distance should be decanted vigorously, is that true also with the growler? Yes. Yeah. Regardless of the container type, I'm assuming most people are going to drink this wine in the next year. And so I thought I made a comment about that. No, I did not. Yes, I did. So if you're going to drink this wine in the next year or 2 years, you do want to be vigorous with your decanting. I guess let's talk about that. There's a learning lesson there. The idea of decanting is kind of confusing in the sense that most people will dump a bottle into a growler and call that decanting. The reality is what you're doing is aerating. The act of decanting or dumping a bottle into a decanter or a vase or whatever. The whole purpose of decanting is to remove sediment, meaning as this wine ages, it's gonna create sediment. The purpose of decanting is to remove the sediment from the wine, so when you drink it, you're not drinking sediment. We use the term decanting kind of as a ubiquitous term to add oxygen. However, that's not necessarily the correct way to use that term. The idea of aerating through decanting is a little bit more telling in the sense that I'm decanting for the purpose of aerating, which means that when you do that technique, you literally want to dump that bottle upside down and be as vigorous as possible. You want to shake that decanter. You want to add as much oxygen to that wine as possible. As this wine ages, you're going to want to do that less. So if you're going to hold on to this wine for 3, 4, 5 years, when it comes time to opening that bottle and decanting, you're not decanting for aeration, you're decanting for sediment. So you want to be more gentle with how you pour that wine into that container. Yeah, I think that one of the things that needs to be added to the text sheet, which we can make, we'll just squeeze more into this, is the pairing suggestions for these wines. Some of this is left off mainly because I don't know when someone's going to drink them, and obviously that changes the pairing. But in reality, assuming you're going to drink it as a current release, kind of how that pairing will be set up. Also, the other thing about these tech sheets, obviously we keep changing the shape. They go from small to big to small. I'm trying to find the right shape, and I think this is going to be the file format. This is a 6x9, mainly because a half binder is 6x9. And ultimately what we're trying to do is create a resource for members where they can keep these in a place that makes sense, that's organized in such a way where they can access these tech sheets. But more importantly, what I really love about that idea is that it gives us the opportunity to add more reference material to that binder, meaning a glossary of terms, descriptions of key varietals, kind of a growing AVA list, maybe bios in terms of the winemakers that we work with. It becomes kind of just a resource for our members that just adds more story and content to the product that we're talking about. And so this year has all been about figuring out the new model of Wine Club, getting these tech sheets and kind of the digital side of this in terms of the QR code and the video recording all kind of in sync. Next year, we're going to look to add more value to this by creating a more comprehensive binder to put these in, while at the same time also enhancing the website. So there's a lot of cool things that are in the works for us for sure. All right, friends. Really appreciate you guys. Thank y'all so much for watching. If you have anybody you want to refer for members, you know where to send them.